So, good morning, good evening. We've got people trickling in to the participants list. The numbers are ticking up. I'll give everyone a couple of seconds more to get into place, but I am delighted to moderate today's panel discussion on transition plans and how they can be used to drive finance towards transition investments. We have a busy lineup, and I would like to leave enough time for Q&A at the end of the session. Please do feel free to drop any questions that you may have in the Q&A box throughout the session. No need to wait until the end, and we will pick those up and make sure that they're directed at the right panelist following the discussions. So, to kick things off, there is a huge amount of interest emerging around the role of transition plans in the global race to net zero. The impacts of climate change are becoming increasingly visible through more intense floods, droughts, wildfires, crop losses, and impacts on societies around the world. The goal today is to talk a little bit about transition plans and how they can help in the efforts to shift whole sectors and whole economies to a low carbon pathway. I would like to welcome our speakers from Climate Bonds, Ceres, CDP, and IIGCC. Sylvester Bamkole is a senior climate analyst on CDP's climate change team, leading the technical work on developing and assessing transition plans. Laura Draucker joins us today from Ceres and is the Director of Corporate Greenhouse Gas Emissions, focused on increasing uptake of credible plans and targets from corporates. Matthew MacGeoch is a transition analyst at Climate Bonds Initiative and has been deeply involved in the development and use of tools to assess transition plans and transition finance. Finally, I'd like to welcome Dan Gardiner, who is joining us from IIGCC. He is their transition plan specialist. So I would like to pass over now to our first speaker, trying to keep in time. I'd like to welcome Matthew to the stage, as it were. And I believe that he has some slides to share. So welcome, Matthew.
Thanks very much, Rachel, and welcome everyone once again. So together with my colleague Manshu, we're going to walk you through some of the key hallmarks of a credible transition, talk you through what transition plan, the state of transition plans roughly looks like at the moment, as well as then kind of broader implications about what financial instruments are available and what stakeholders can do to support this development. But thank you very much, Gabriella, for helping to share the slides. And if we could just move straight on to the first slide, given that we don't have a huge amount of time. So Climate Bonds, since 2021, has been pushing this narrative of the 5 hallmarks of a credible company transition, as you can see them in front of you. Just to walk you through them very briefly as well. What do we mean by performance targets? Well, in particular, we're looking at Paris-aligned targets. So what we want to see is companies selecting a common sectoral decarbonisation pathway and showing how that not only that sector is going to align, but how they as individual companies and as issuers are going to align with a 1.5 degree future. This pathway should be technologically feasible, but also scientifically evidenced as to how it aligns with the existing carbon budget. And there are many sources available for companies to utilize, but from SBTI, the Transition Pathway Initiative, the ACT Initiative, CBI has some pathways too, as well as various other sector-specific bodies. We'd also then like to see company-specific KPIs that demonstrate how they're going to align with that pathway. So a simple example would be for an energy company trying to target, okay, what proportion of their energy output is going to come from renewable energy versus traditional fossil fuel based forms of energy as kind of secondary KPIs to support their overall decarbonization targets. The next hallmark is then foundation and vision. And what we mean by this is for the company to establish a vision and a strategic narrative of where the company is now, where is it going to go, what technologies or assets or business streams are they going to pivot towards, and identifying key kind of risks and opportunities of change, basing this all off of existing market trends and policy assumptions. But then also it's important to have this narrative to not only demonstrate their commitment to investors and external stakeholders, but also internally to make sure that everybody within the company is on board and working towards the same target. The next hallmark, hallmark 3, implementation action, is then about actually putting that narrative and those targets into practice. In particular, we want to see 3 key things. We want to see an action plan that is inclusive of all emission sources. We want to see a financing plan, and we want to see internal policy alignment as well. And what do I mean by those 3 things? So for action plan, we want to see what business streams are the company going to pivot towards, what technology is the company going to utilize, and what other actions can the company take place in terms of perhaps energy efficiency improvements or every little last thing that they can implement in order to help the decarbonisation journey. The financing plan then needs to help demonstrate how they're going to put these, what financing they're going to put aside for this action plan. And ideally, this focuses then on their capital expenditure as well as their operating expenditure. So for example, in a capital allocation report, we want to see a breakdown of how much of their capex in the next year, in the next 5 years, and the next 10 years is going to be set aside for the transition. And then in terms of internal policy alignment, we want to make sure that, especially in the larger companies, each department is aligned with not only the broader organization level narrative, but also then with their own sub-targets. Hallmark 4 then is internal monitoring and governance. And what we want to see first and foremost is board and senior executive ownership of this transition plan, as well as oversight then of their progress, of the company's progress against the transition plan. Then there should be kind of internal tracking and performance evaluation and recalibration against the KPIs established in Hallmark 1. And they should be regularly reviewed and recalibrated to reflect changing operating conditions and market developments. And then in case of underperformance on an annual basis, we want to see that there is the capabilities and the systems in place for the company to address issues as to why they haven't been able to achieve. Because ultimately this transition will not be linear, but will take years to progress against. And we want companies to be working the best they can against their targets, but also it's a part of reality that sometimes they may miss the mark. And what we want to help foster, though, is that kind of continued focus on how they can continue to do better. And then lastly, external reporting and disclosure. A lot of work has been done in this space already, but we want companies to publicly disclose their progress against their own targets, the methodologies that they're using to measure those targets, as well as any other relevant information and statistics. And we want all of this to then be also independently verified so that a third-party assurance provider, for example, can help provide the relevant details. So in terms of the current status of transition plans, recently at Climate Bonds, we developed, we wrote this report looking at transition plans in the ASEAN region. And in particular, we looked at a few hard to abate sectors. And we found that while some did have kind of key elements of these transition plans in place already, a lot of work still remains to make sure that they are credible, comparable, and fully costed as well. So coming back to those 5 hallmarks, you can see very quickly a summary table there of how we rated each of these companies' transition plans against each of those hallmarks. Next slide, please. So then in terms of financing these transition plans, what instruments are already in place? So we've got use of proceeds bonds, and these are green bonds as well as transition bonds that exist where money is being financed to specific assets and activities. And we also have performance-linked bonds, also known as sustainability-linked bonds, which are tied to relevant targets. And so if we just pop into the next slide very quickly again, we can see that with use of proceeds instruments, the frameworks are already in place with taxonomy development worldwide, but SLBs can really be powerful instruments to help demonstrate companies' commitment to their transition by tying those key greenhouse gas targets right at the very top of the pyramid from their transition plans onto their SLBs as well. Lots of critiques exist about SLBs, but they should, the targets involved should include all material scopes of emissions.
So Gabriella, could we move on to our next presentation, which is from Sylvester Bamkole. Unfortunately, Manchu's connection wasn't very clear, and it seems that we've lost her altogether now. So Sylvester, I'll pass over to you.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Can you hear me all right for now?
Yes.
Brilliant. Let me just share my screen and then we're good to go. So, 1 second. Can you all see that all right? Okay, so
yep.
First of all, just another thank you to CBI for organising this event. And over the next sort of 10 minutes or so, what I'd like to do is to talk to you about CDP's work on transition plans and give you a brief introduction into why to disclose climate transition plans, the benefits of disclosing these plans, and how the CDP disclosure mechanism can serve as a robust way to disclose credible climate transition plans. I'm then going to signpost you to some resources which expand on some of the concepts that we'll be discussing today. So for those who've not had the opportunity to work closely or deal with CDP, CDP is a global non-profit that runs the world's one of the world's largest environmental disclosure systems for investors, companies, cities, and governments to assess their impact and take urgent action needed to build a truly sustainable economy. And the CDP vision is to see a thriving economy that works for people and planet in the long term. Now, as you can see from this slide, the way by which we intend on realizing this vision is communicated by the CDP mission, which is to focus investors, companies, cities, and governments on measuring and acting on their environmental impact to build this sustainable economy. And this is all underpinned by CDP's theory of change, which is that by asking the right questions, we incentivize the disclosure of the right information, which stakeholders can then leverage to draw out relevant insights. And then this inspires much needed environmental action. And then that feeds back into this disclosure insight action sort of feedback loop. And on transition plans, the mission remains the same. So we want to keep asking the right questions around transition plans so that companies and financial institutions are disclosing decision useful information to allow investors, policymakers, and regulators to get much needed insight needed to take action. So why disclose climate transition plans as a company or a financial institution? Well, organizations typically set emissions reductions targets, commit to monitoring their progress on climate action, and reduce their exposure to climate-related risks. Now, what a climate transition plan does is it serves as this all-capturing instrument that helps organizations to align their various climate and, in some cases, the wider environmental ambitions. So to answer the question of why to disclose climate transition plans as a company or a financial institution, well, the need for a climate transition plan has been accelerated really by a rapidly evolving regulatory landscape, and organizations that have prepared for regulatory change will avoid potential regulatory shocks. And as you can see from the slide I'm currently showing, there's been an acceleration really within the regulatory landscape from Mark Carney referencing transition plans in his Road to Glasgow speech, to TCFD updating its thought leadership on transition plans. And in the bottom track, you can see CDP's work in this space dating back to 2015, right to the formation of the ACT initiative, which assesses transition within a number of specific high impact sectors. So in terms of the benefits of disclosing climate transition plans, well, as I mentioned, within the regulatory landscape, a lot of the action that we've seen in terms of why companies are disclosing, or the interest and uptake in transition plans has accelerated as being because companies are wanting to put themselves in a position where they are insulated from potential regulatory shocks. So from the likes of TCFD, GFANS, and upcoming work from IFRS, EFRAG in the EU, US SEC, and the UK TPT, we've seen a lot of potential upcoming regulation, and companies that have prepared for these regulatory changes will avoid potential regulatory shocks across multiple jurisdictions where these regulations may apply. Now, on the second point of streamlining and alignment, as I mentioned in the previous slide, the transition plan really serves as this all-capturing instrument that helps organizations to align their various environmental and climate ambitions. And this alignment is achieved by establishing specific strategies and clear accountability mechanisms to track progress. On the third point, by disclosing credible transition plans, organizations are able to demonstrate to relevant stakeholders, whether that be policymakers, regulators, investors, or their own shareholders, that their business will continue to remain relevant and, importantly, profitable in a 1.5 aligned economy. And I think Matthew mentioned this in his presentation as well. And of course, the transition plan serves as an accountability mechanism to ensure implementation of an organization's climate ambitions. So how does the CDP disclosure platform serve as a robust mechanism to disclose credible climate transition plans? Well, on this slide, what we're looking at here is a heat map of identified elements of a credible plan, according to CDP anyway. And this is juxtaposed against disclosure recommendations from existing bodies, such as the IFRS, US SEC, UK TPT, so on and so forth. And what this heat map demonstrates is where the CDP climate change questionnaire covers or does not fully cover the disclosure requirements set by a particular body. So for context, the darker the color in the aligned cell on the right, the stronger the alignment between CDP's climate change questionnaire and the disclosure requirements set by that particular body. Now, I understand this is quite a lot to take in, but the take-home message here is that across the board, by disclosing to these elements in the far left section of the slide, an organization is broadly meeting the disclosure requirement of credible climate transition plan from thought leadership and upcoming transition plan regulation in this space. And again, just tying this back to what Matthew covered in his presentation, you can see that a lot of those hallmarks are reflected in these elements. So to further evidence the robustness of the CDP climate change questionnaire to capture this information, I'm now going to talk you through where in the questionnaire these questions can be located. And when I make a reference to indicators, what I mean are questions which align directly to the climate transition plan elements as we defined in the previous slide. So within CDP's climate change questionnaire, we have a number of indicators which can be broken up into two blocks. Now, the first block are what we refer to as direct indicators. Now, these are questions which allow organizations to indicate that their climate transition plan includes forward-looking and quantitative information, such as associated financial planning details and climate-related targets. Now, if I give you an example, if we look under financial planning, the question code is C3.5A. And what that question asks is for organizations to disclose, to quantify, their spending or revenue, which is aligned to their climate transition. And organizations are able to report in a variety of financial metrics, whether that be CapEx, OpEx, revenue, R&D spend, in the reporting year, in 2025 and in 2030. And what this does is this gives, let's say, investors, for example, or relevant stakeholders visibility on how an organization is planning to facilitate the transition. And on the other hand, we have supporting indicators. Now, these are other CDP questions which allow organizations to report actions and data that add robustness and credibility to the information disclosed within their transition plan, such as the foundational elements of governance, for example. And these supporting indicators may not necessarily be forward-looking or quantitative in nature, but they definitely add to the completeness of the plan. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to expand on this slide, but what I've done is I've included some useful links to CDP resources on this topic, and also to the UK Transition Plan Task Force webpage, which provides UK-specific context on this discussion. And another thing I wanted to use this opportunity to signpost is that within the next few weeks, CDP will be releasing a technical note, which showcases how financial institutions can report in line with GFANS and ICAP's transition plan guidance using their CDP disclosure. So with that concludes my presentation for this afternoon. But yeah, feel free to reach out to myself within or outside this forum to carry on the conversation. Thank you very much. I'm just going to stop sharing my slides now.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sylvester. That was really interesting. We've had some questions come through for CDP, but I'll come back to those at the end after we've heard from Laura and Dan. So coming up next, we have Laura from Ceres. And I understand, so Sylvester, we're still seeing your screen, I think.
Are you able to rob the screen off me by any chance? I'm struggling to find the button to let me stop sharing my screen.
Fantastic, thank you. So Laura, I will hand over to yourself now to talk a little bit about the landscape.
Wonderful, thanks. Happy to be here. Laura Draucker, I work at Ceres, which is a US-based nonprofit that works to move companies, investors, and financial markets to transform the economy and build a just and sustainable future for people and the planet. I'll be speaking today about work we did with several partners. We mean Business Coalition, CDP, and EDF with support from Ramble Consulting to identify how transition plans can support forward-looking actions. And thus the process, and through the process, we addressed many of the questions that were posed at the top of this webinar. But first, I just want to give a quick overview of the Ceres Ambition 2030 initiative, which focuses on decarbonizing the 6 sectors responsible for 80% of US GHG emissions and global emissions as well, really. Oil and gas sector, electric power, transportation, food, steel, and banks. And while approximately 40% of the world's largest 2,000 companies have net zero goals, many do not, particularly in these hard to abate and high emitting sectors. And even those that do have goals are often not showing the qualitative progress that we need to see. This is according to groups like SBTI, CDP, Net Zero Tracker, and others. And further, while target setting and disclosure are both deeply important, we need near-term specific actions from companies with the urgency of 2030 approaching. And this is why we see climate transition action plans, or CTAPs, as being so important. Therefore, a big part of Ceres Ambition 2030, sorry, you can stay on that slide, I'll let you know. A big part of Ceres Ambition 2030 strategy is to collaborate with others to establish expectations for CTAPs, engage and equip companies to implement these plans, and monitor the ambition of goals and progress against them. Our Ambition 2030 website tracks how each of these sectors is doing on goal setting and disclosure. And over time, we hope to add more data related to transition planning and progress. Next slide, please. So to start the process of developing the CTAP report and tools that we're going to share with you during this session, we first did a landscape assessment and survey. The landscape was to determine what was already out there in terms of transition plan guidance, and the survey was to determine what, if anything, was still needed to build consensus on transition plans and help companies take specific near-term actions to meet their science-based goals. Next slide, please. And all the links will be provided to you during the session. So we started with the landscape assessment, and from 31 guidance documents that were reviewed, both sector specific and sector neutral, we identified the following most cited transition plan topics. The topics that are starred here are the ones that the partners identified as being important early on. And so from this, we note that public policy and climate justice seem to both be underrepresented in existing guidance compared to the other starred elements. We also hypothesized that some of this, particularly around public policy, may be due to the unique political landscape in the US, which may be why it's not featured quite as in detail in some of the more global guidances. Next slide, please. So in parallel to the landscape assessment, we surveyed and interviewed companies and investors on their experience with transition plans and transition plan guidance. We found that many did look to guidance when developing CTAPs, but some of them found that the guidance was lengthy and not quite as helpful as needed to navigate both investor expectations or to understand specific areas where they felt less clear on the path forward. From investors, we heard that they weren't seeing exactly what they were looking for, and both investors and companies were asking for examples of good plans to help support their engagements and decisions. Some specific suggestions we got from the survey as ways that we could potentially help fill some of these gaps. We're really focused on step-by-step roadmaps, actionable steps and guidance, case studies, examples, and the need to focus on implementation in addition to target setting and disclosure. A really interesting output from the survey was that the most cited resource companies reported using to develop transition plans was the Science Based Targets Initiative. And while we feel very strongly and support very strongly SBTI and the need for companies to have near-term and long-term 1.5C targets, those are a foundational piece and are not on their own a transition plan. So we definitely saw a need for some more support here to move from goals to action. Next slide, please. So based on all this, we moved forward with our CTAP guide with a goal to provide consistency with other guidance, but with a focus on being really short, sweet, and user-friendly, and as action-oriented as possible. So to do this, we condensed the guidance and common topics I showed earlier on an earlier slide into these 4 core components. Recognizing that while reducing emissions is the main goal, and that requires emission reduction strategies, which are shown here in box 1, companies would simply not be successful in achieving those without acting holistically. And in addition to emission reduction strategies, identifying actions that address governance and business strategy integration, public policy, and just transition. If you recall from the earlier slide on the landscape, workforce engagement was a separate topic, but we've rolled that into just transition together with climate justice. We put a real focus on tools to support action. And in the report, we include some resources to equip companies to publish a plan across these four components. A template to create a CTAP, a checklist to ensure that they're prepared to create a CTAP, and also to just help identify where gaps may exist and what actions they might want to focus on in the year. And then a simple progress reporting template. And so these are all available on our website in editable versions. And again, we'll include the links. So when you look through these, you'll notice that we focus on really forward-looking actions versus disclosing past actions. And this is really to help investors see evidence of implementation. We've suggested that companies consider updating their CTAPs every 1 to 3 years to share progress and disclose new actions and strategies. Next slide, please. So just as an indication of how fast this space is moving, since we published our report 5 months ago in October, more peer guidance has been both updated and newly released, notably from GFANZ, the UK government's Transition Plan Task Force, and most recently, IIGCC. And despite some differences in the overall organizational structure or potentially at the subtopic level, the good news is that the majority of these frameworks are really well aligned. Next slide, please. And this is just our attempt to map a few of these using sort of the TCFD guidance as an anchor. You can see that these 5 leading frameworks are relatively similar, including most, if not all, of the same elements, either directly or as a subtopic in another element. An example of that is governance. So governance is called out in TCFD, TPT, and GFANZ, and the We Mean Business Series, CDP, and EDF document. And it's also included just as prominently in IIGCC as part of their strategy bucket. All suggest metrics and targets. Some specifically ask for science-based or science-aligned targets consistent with limiting temperature rise to 1.5. And there's a few things that are mentioned specifically. So here you see TCFD mentions risk management specifically and separately, IIGCC climate solutions, and the We Mean Business report I've been speaking about, just transition. But again, all of these topics are covered in different subsectors of all of these guidances. So we really just feel a company can't go wrong using any of these to develop and importantly implement a transition plan. Next slide, please. So just to close out, we see our transition plan resource as a helpful tool for a company to use directly to develop a transition plan or to support or complement other transition plan disclosure frameworks they are using or guidance they're following. We work closely with Sylvester and his team, partnered on this report, and there's a lot of collaboration happening across NGOs and partners in this space. We also see our resources as tools for investors to use when they're evaluating a company's transition plan, and importantly, for both companies and investors to use to identify next steps to further drive progress. So we're actively taking feedback on what works and doesn't work for both companies and investors so we can continue to update and refine our resource. We're especially interested in collecting examples of quote unquote good transition plans across the 6 Ambition 2030 sectors to use that to scale engagement. We already have some sector specific CTAP guidance for the food sector that I can share in a link. And we are determining what additional sector specific guidance we may need or can be elevated from other partner organizations. And of course, we continue to partner with other organizations and build off the work that they're doing to support consistency and avoid confusion, because at the end of the day, what we really want is companies and investors to be able to focus their time on taking actions. So with that, I will say thank you and welcome questions at the end of the session or any feedback over email at another time.
Thank you very much, Laura. Yes, I can absolutely understand the rapid emergence of guidance on this. We do our own tracking for the guidance, and it's just a continual updating process. But the good news is, as you said, we are all aligned. So we're all getting it right. Fantastic. I would like to introduce Dan Gardiner now from IIGCC, who will be speaking a little bit about transition plans with the IIGCC and the investor landscape. So welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Rachel. Can I just check you can all hear me before I continue? Great.
Yep, loud and clear.
Brilliant. So good morning, evening and afternoon from me. So my name is Dan Gardiner. I'm the transition research specialist here at IIGCC. For those of you that don't know the IIGCC, the Institutional Investor Group on Climate Change, it's Europe's leading body for investor collaboration on climate change. It works both directly and alongside equivalent regional investor networks, aiming to provide our members with resources and tools to help them with their engagement, voting and portfolio alignment strategies. I've been asked as Rachel's trail to kind of give a short presentation on our perspective on transition plans. Essentially, I'm aiming to cover what we see as important, how we assess them, and how our approach may be slightly different from others focus on this topic. I'm going to skim the surface in 10 minutes, but hopefully it'll give you a flavour. This slide here is essentially a safe harbour statement covering disclosure and coordination of strategic or confidential information. I think that will be enough of that if we move to the next slide. Thank you. So this slide is possibly the most important in the deck. Many investor members are essentially making commitments to align their portfolios with net zero. There are, as I'm sure many on the call we're aware, there are a variety of frameworks that they can use to make those commitments, but the most popular at the moment is the Net Zero Investment Framework, or NZIF. Currently, we estimate over 150 investors with 20 trillion in AUM have made commitments using this framework. We don't have time, and it's not directly my kind of area of expertise to kind of cover the NZIF in detail, but essentially it asks investors to set targets for the proportion of their portfolio covered by net zero targets. Engagement asks, so the number of companies that they would engage with to take climate action, and also to publish and set and publish, I should say, climate solutions targets. But it's more than just a target setting guidance. It also provides an overall framework for how investors should behave more broadly, including the governance and policy interactions. Particularly relevant for our topic today, it sets criteria by which investors can assess the alignment of their assets across 5 asset classes: sovereigns, real estate, infrastructure, which was released last week, and corporate debt and equity. Critically, one of the principles of the NZIF is that it's aiming to drive real world emissions reductions. So it's not trying to set guidance which is asking investors essentially to divest. It's asking them to encourage engagement and to drive real world reductions at the assets that they hold. And with that in mind, it's critical that they have an understanding of how credible transition plans are in order to set and meet those targets. As you can see here, the kind of 6 corporate alignment criteria, which are based on emissions risk, are familiar to everyone who's kind of sat through the preceding 30 minutes. They essentially cover emissions targets, how companies are going to deliver them, adequate disclosure, and aligning capital and a part of that delivery strategy of how they're going to align capex. And there's also additional criteria which apply to assessing how companies interact with the broader environment on policy, governance, and just transition elements. So essentially the point of this slide is that when we at IIGCC are thinking about transition plans, it's really guided by the NZIF and the data requirements and engagement needs of our members. And that's our kind of North Star in setting out what criteria are particularly relevant. We could go to the next slide. Thank you. So what constitutes a good transition plan consistent with NZIF? So I think some of the previous speakers have already alluded to, there is a lot of consensus in general about what this definition should include, but they're also slightly subtly different in many aspects, and there are continually emerging ideas. So if you ask kind of 10 people in this space what a good transition looks like, you will get like 10 different answers, and with each one kind of adding a new idea to the list. And I guess we were kind of initially reluctant to add our 2 penneth into this, but we did feel that our members needed something fully consistent with the NZIF, and also to help us kind of guide our areas of policy engagement as well, essentially to ensure that we were aligned internally and that members had the resources they need as well. So I'm pleased to say that, and it's nice of Ceres to pick up on this, that we published our investor expectations document last week, and it's now available to everyone on the IIGCC website. But relating to our comments previously, rather than building a kind of long shopping list, the approach that we took in this document, at least initially, was that we wanted to essentially simplify the ask conceptually to kind of position what we thought were the important components, rather than just set out a very long list of demands from investors and of corporates. So essentially, this slide sets out those conceptual asks. First on the list, consistent with possibly everything that you will have seen already, is a comprehensive company-wide commitment to net zero with aligned emissions and targets. This is a foundational component, clearly. It builds on the concept that emissions in the value chain equal transition risk, equal financial risk, and that companies arguably have some obligation to act on under their fiduciary duty. Companies are also have what we're looking for here is the alignment of that target. So consistent with the NZIF and consistent with the CA100 and other frameworks on this call, we're looking to assess alignment against that 1.5 degree pathway. So the next component is a credible strategy. So if we just keep on the previous slide, that'd be great. The next component is a credible strategy to deliver those targets. So increasingly investors don't see a target without a plan to deliver as credible. And we have, within our guidance documents, we've kind of set out a number of sub-criteria by which the credibility of a strategy can be assessed. So looking at technological, economic feasibility, minimal use of offsets, capital alignment, et cetera, all ways of kind of interrogating the credibility of the delivery, rather than in addition to, I should say, the targets. And then the third component here is essentially recognizing, particularly when you're dealing with value chain emissions, that companies are not going to be able to deliver on all their plans in isolations, and to assess whether they have a credible engagement strategy to overcome broader hurdles across the economy and society more broadly. So that includes looking at their policy engagement, their value chain engagement, communities and employees under the kind of just transition umbrella. So those are the kind of, I guess, those three elements kind of constitute the core of the ask. But in addition to that, we've got specific data requests under NZIF, which are relate to setting out a climate solution strategy where relevant, and providing the disclosure that investors need in order to make their assessments. So if we could turn to the next slide. So this slide essentially sets out how those conceptual asks have been translated into what we've called subcomponents. A question that we get asked a lot, and has been a theme of previous speakers, is how does our framework compare to others out there in development? And a point I want to emphasize that Rachel's touched on already is there is a lot of overlap with existing frameworks. In this slide, I've kind of called out TPT, GFANS and CBI, but obviously there are plenty of others. And in this document, like as we saw from CDP, we map out indicator by indicator how they relate for the benefit of users, as in our members and companies looking to set transition plans additionally. What we did find, however, was that there was not one document that had all the elements we needed to support NZIF in one place. So our document aims to kind of fill some of those gaps. I've called out a couple here. So one of the things that we've been looking to introduce both here in the CA100 is this assessment of historic emissions and their alignment trajectory, and also a more fully fledged disclosures of climate solution strategy. But there are other elements that where we potentially differentiate, our approach is potentially differentiated. We focus, as previously said, exclusively or predominantly on transition risk. So the metrics that we're trying to encourage are those that help our members assess the credibility of emissions targets and their strategy for delivery, and useful for investors in their engagement and portfolios. We are looking to solicit data that can be assessed for alignment. That means tested against a climate benchmark to see whether that strategy is aligned or not. And not all data that is solicited by transition plan frameworks is equally useful in this respect. And then additionally, this paper introduces a concept called cumulative benchmark divergence, which is a way of assessing the alignment of pathways across, the alignment of emissions targets across the pathway, I should say. And we've got more details on that in a dedicated members paper, but it's quite an interesting way of assessing, we think quite a useful way of assessing emissions targets. And then finally, I pulled out here the engagement of the value chain and how to assess alignment of engagement aspects. And this is something that was missing previously from the CA100 framework, for example. So if we turn to the last slide just quickly, and then, so that summarizes our approach. There's a lot of work that we've done here recently, but we've got quite a lot still to do, and my job is working with our members to kind of help define some of the guidance around some of the topics here. And just to give a plug for a pipeline of further work that's coming down the track. So we've got some sector-specific frameworks on oil and gas and banking and diversified mining that we would expect to be releasing in the first half of this year. And hopefully, as I'm sure everyone is aware, that CA 100 actually announced its new benchmark metrics this morning. So we've got an updated version 2.0 of the CA 100, which is going to be used for assessments in the second half of this year. Thank you, Rachel.
Fantastic, Dan. Thank you so much for that. So we have some questions in the chat. There are some questions that are focused on specific participants. So I'm going to direct some of these questions to the panelists. So the first one is to CDP. So this is to you, Sylvester. And the question is, sorry, it's an anonymous attendee, so I can't call out the name. Is the CDP standard to report on transition identical or aligned with the EU requirements in this area? So we'll just do the first part of this question.
Understood. Can you hear me all right, by the way? My laptop is being weird, but I'm not sure if my audio is working.
Nope, fine.
Fantastic. So is the CDP standard to report on transition aligned with EU requirements in this area? Yes, is the short answer. Now, the way CDP arrived at those elements that I showed you on that heat map was by conducting an initial sort of mapping the landscape exercise. So seeing what the likes of TCFD, Climate Action 100+, what was coming up in the EU in terms of thought leadership on transition plans, and then boiling that down to the most consistent and coherent sort of elements across those individual bodies. So those standards were not developed in a vacuum. However, there are areas of misalignment between that final position versus we've just been doing an internal review actually across the ESRS disclosure requirements. Now, for more detail on the alignments, I'm happy to forward the technical notes, which contains that heat map, and you can see in detail where those specific areas of alignment or misalignments. But broadly speaking, it is aligned. Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you. And there's a question here for Laura. This is from Nicholas Picard Garcia. You mentioned the impact of public policy. So is this additional local parameter something you identified in existing frameworks on transition plans as being a factor that influences the credibility of a plan?
Yeah, happy to address that. I think for many companies, if not all companies, they're just simply not going to be able to achieve their climate goals without really strong policies and government support, right? Particularly companies that rely on developing technologies, if that's sort of their long-term decarbonization plan. Their near-term plans need to include what actions they're taking on investment and research, which often needs government support and policy to scale. So what we hear from investors and what we think would make a transition plan credible is a company that's relying, for example, as in this question, on hydrogen. What are they doing right now this year to advance that work? What resources are they putting in? And how are they advocating for government support there? We also see this as an opportunity when companies maybe feel stuck in a certain place. They in the US recently, I'm sure many other places, but from my context, we're struggling with renewable energy deployment. So we have a lot of projects in the queue and they're not getting put in the ground due to permitting and other issues. Companies, so then what could there's an opportunity for companies just to say that this is a delay. There's also an opportunity for companies to say, okay, here are the actions we're taking to engage our local representatives and federal and state policies and try to push forward reforms that will make these projects happen more quickly. So those are the kinds of actions we're looking for, and sort of, what are you doing this year to help make that happen?
Thank you, Laura. So Dan, I might direct this question to you, but it is open to all of the panelists because the panel and organization wasn't specified. But it's a question from Prab Hakar, and it's, would be great to know what percentage of companies or financial institutions are willing to disclose their climate risks, and who are most likely to disclose their climate risks, and what incentives or conditions are necessary for voluntary risk disclosure. So Dan, I don't know if you want to have a stab at that one.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. So that's an interesting question. I don't know quite how climate risks are being defined in that question. So it might be that might be a good place to. I mean, it's difficult to kind of answer it directly, but one of the things that we have been looking. One of the things that we start as a central premise is that emissions within the value chain constitutes transition risk, and that is leads to financial risk, as I was saying. That's one way you can interpret the answer. But there's also a kind of more sophisticated approach that I know that some of our members and sell-side analysts are kind of looking at, which is where you kind of look at profits related to emissions intensive activities, and you can aggregate that up. One of the things that, in a related kind of further extension of that we've been doing here, is kind of looking at climate accounting and looking at emission scenarios, and what companies have been disclosing would be their profits or balance sheets or cash flows under certain climate scenarios. And I think that's something that we hopefully will see more on. That's certainly something that's really taking that concept of emissions and communicating to our members, investors more broadly, like what is the financial impact of the transition if it were to proceed along a certain pathway. So those are kind of three ways I think about it, but maybe others have got better ideas.
I'm happy to just quickly say something on this, actually, if that's all right. So we recently released our report on the global state of credible climate transition plan disclosure. And across all the individual elements of what constitutes a credible climate transition plan, we had risks and opportunities being the highest element being disclosed to. So for context, in the last disclosure cycle, we had about 18,000 organizations disclose their environmental impacts through CDP's climate change questionnaire. And about 33% of that number disclosed sufficient detail on risks and opportunities, and risks and opportunities were the highest disclosed to. And in contrast, information on financial planning to facilitate the transition and science-based targets were actually the poorest performing. So just, yeah, in terms of percentage, that's what we're seeing from the most recent assessment we've just done. And I guess what incentives enable these conditions? Well, there's also regional, we haven't really done that assessment in a lot of detail, but there's a regional assessment in that report as well. And I mean, I would hazard a guess that, a more accommodative political landscape where there's well-defined regulatory frameworks around these disclosures would facilitate better disclosure on climate-related risks.
Thank you, Sylvester. And we have a question here that I might direct to Matthew, and I might also jump in on this one. So it's, what do you suggest for independent verification and ensuring credibility of transition plans? Without a standard, how can they be assured by an external consultant? So I have some thoughts, but I'm happy to pass this to Matthew as you haven't had a chance to jump in yet.
No problem. Well, on that lovely note, perhaps it's a nice time to plug some of CBI's work in this space. So in terms of creating standards, we've already released sector-specific criteria for the cement, steel, and basic chemical sectors. And on April 13th, we'll also be launching our broader certification scheme. So this kind of transition plan level certification will take place together with what we call our verifiers, who are often kind of third-party assurance providers, or they also work sometimes as second-party opinion providers in the sustainable finance landscape. But essentially, the process will entail the assessment of transition plans against those sector-specific criteria and against those kind of cross-cutting sector-agnostic criteria as well, to make sure that all the relevant financing, governance mechanisms, targets, practices are in place at the company level, and then also then at a sector-specific level, what assets and technologies, what emission reduction potentials are there for each relevant kind of business practice. But Rachel, feel free to add anything else as well.
No, thank you very much, Matthew. Good plug there. We're releasing our standard version for today, which will allow for the certification of transition plans along with entities. But I would like to say, because of the convergence of the guidance between CDP, IIGCC, GFANS, TPT, Ceres, and all the other actors in this space, and because there are a large number of pathways and performance targets and guidance on that coming out now, we can start to assess transition plans. It's not easy, but we can start to assess these transition plans ourselves. We've had a few questions about whether or not the slides can be shared. I think we're all happy to send those slides along to participants afterwards. And we are at the hour, so I'm going to say thank you for everybody on our panel. And thank you for the hundreds and hundreds of people who have been joining live from around the world and who have been engaging in this. We didn't get a chance to answer all the questions. I'm very sorry for that. I'll try my best to go through them and see if we can send some answers out afterwards. But on that note, I'd like to say thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.